ud til at finansiere Kontrasts medlemmer. Hvis du kan lide det, du hører, så meld dig ind.
Well, I think I'll be doing my brief introduction in Danish, and then I'll get back to you.
Sure.
Ja. Velkommen til alle sammen. Som I nok ved, så hedder jeg Mikkel Andersen. Jeg er chefredaktør for Kontrast, og jeg glæder mig virkelig meget til at kunne introducere dagens taler. Det er forfatter, journalist og politisk kommentator Douglas Murray. Han er forfatter til for nylig bogen The Madness of Crowds. Den hedder på dansk, og den er udkommet på dansk, der hedder den Hordernes Hærgen. Og så har han også lidt før det, der har han udgivet The Strange Death of Europe, der også er udgivet på dansk, begge to på forlaget Ellekær, og den hedder Europas undergang, og jeg kan anbefale begge to rigtig varmt. Formatet i dag, det kommer til at blive sådan, at jeg, ligesom med vores interview med Erik Kaufmann her forleden dag, der kommer jeg til at overlade ordet i cirka 20 minutter til Douglas Murray, og derefter så interviewer jeg ham, og til sidst så får jeg mulighed for at stille spørgsmål, og det kan I selvfølgelig gøre både ved at række hånden op via funktionen her, så kan I komme på via video, eller alternativt, som jo det de fleste foretrækker, har vi efterhånden erfaret, så kan I skrive et par kommentarer over i det tekstfeltet, herovre i chatfeltet i højre side af jeres Zoom-app. Og så til sidst, det er en ny ting, så har jeg fået pænt besøg af Christian Markussen. Han er politisk kommentator og skribent på blandt andet Berlingsk, og vi kommer til at perspektivere nogle af de ting, som Douglas Murray han siger i en dansk kontekst til allersidst som afslutning på arrangementet. Det kommer til at vare cirka 20 minutter. Så alt i alt vil jeg gætte på maks 1,5 time, så I har en idé om, hvordan det kommer til at vare. Så nu vil jeg give ordet til Douglas Murray. So that was my little introductory bit in English. I'm giving the floor to you, Douglas. Please make your presentation.
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you all. It's a great pleasure to speak with Kontrast. I'm sorry not to be able to do it in person. Denmark, I have to say, is one of my favorite countries to visit, and one of the, I think, most interesting perspectives nationally that I know. It's been my great honor and pleasure to visit your country many times in recent years. And I really hope vaccines and everything else going right, that it's possible to do this again in person sometime soon. Nothing will give me more pleasure than to be back in Copenhagen. But today, obviously, virtually, we're discussing this issue of identity politics, of issues which I wrote about in my most recent book, The Madness of Crowds. But if perhaps I should say in introduction that I also am much looking forward to Q&A discussions later, because there is something very interesting about the identity politics discussion, which is that it is both the same absolutely everywhere and always with slight regional changes, slight regional twists, and of course regional additions. The deep underlying pattern of identity politics is now very clear, but there's an awful lot of local color that comes into it, which I'd love to hear about and hear your perspectives about when we get to the period of this of today where we have general discussion. I'll start at the beginning of this, which is that what I had noticed and what I observed in the Madness of Crowds has been going on in recent years, you might even say recent decades, has been a slow but significant change in the underlying metaphysics, that is, the underlying religious presumptions of the societies that we live in. When I say the societies we live in, I'm principally talking about the developed West and the Anglosphere. Europe, North America, Canada, Australia, and we'll get back to exactly why that might be, but that all of these countries have been shifting their metaphysical structures in the lifetimes of, I think, most of us engaged today. I addressed some of the roots of that in The Strange Death of Europe, which you kindly referred to in the introduction. But The Strange Death of Europe explained some of what I think has been going on in terms of the loss of the metaphysical structure we'd had, that we, broadly speaking, had come from the Judeo-Christian tradition. In The Madness of Crowds, I try to grapple with what the new metaphysical structure of our societies might be. Much of the confusion that I think has been going on, much of the unhappiness that has been going on underneath our societies is caused by this metaphysical change, by an alteration in our belief in what is good, what is desirable, what is right, what is virtuous, and much more. And as I say in The Madness of Crowds, it seems to be by now that you can analyze and explain what that change in the metaphysical presumptions of our societies actually are. They seem to be something along the lines of, for instance, and this is just to select one, never be unpleasant to somebody because of a characteristic which they have no choice over. Now that's by the way, it's not an obvious ethical decision to make. There are plenty of societies in the world today, as historically, where that would not be a natural presupposition of the society, but it is in ours, and there's much to be said for it. For instance, you don't judge somebody badly because they're disabled, because it's not as if the person has chosen to be disabled. Extensions of that. Don't judge somebody for an addiction, for instance, which they can't help, and which they are in fact a victim of. This is a very interesting structure to have, not least because it makes a lot of things want to campaign to be something in the same space. Not to make these things seem like I'm saying they're analogous with addiction or disability, but in recent decades, we saw a very significant shift, and a very desirable shift, I think, in relation to society's attitudes towards homosexuality and giving of equal rights to people who are gay. This largely happened through people being persuaded that being gay wasn't a choice, which I think it isn't, but rather something that people couldn't affect or have any say over. This means that other rights claims seek to have similar status. They seek to say, we also don't have any say in the matter. It's not our fault. It's not our choice. Therefore, we would like the rights because it's something we can't affect. I'm giving these examples because these are clearly the underlying girders that now exist in our societies. That's one of them. Another underlying girder appears to be the belief that society can be best understood by segmenting people into particular groups to do with very specific group characteristics and analyzing them, treating them according to their membership of said groups. This, I should say, it's very clear by now what those groups are. They are groupings along racial lines, they are groupings along gender/sex lines, and sexual orientation lines. I highlight this because although that's obvious now, it isn't actually obvious that you should segment society, even if you thought that it was worthwhile to segment society at all. It's not obvious that you would segment society along these lines and select these as the characteristics which have most influence over people's lives or identities. For instance, a major factor in people's life choices to do with career is their height. There are specific jobs, usually to do with, for instance, the police or fire service, where if you are under a certain height, you cannot perform the task. But why should it be that our societies should obsess over race, sexuality, and gender when height might be, for many people, for instance, a very short person who wants to join the police or fire service, a very significant change in their life, a very significant affliction that they cannot do the thing they would like to do. Let me give a couple of other examples. Intelligence, your capacity to solve problems is probably one of the most significant factors in anyone's life that determines what they are and are not going to do. We have not, and I think, by the way, this is desirable, we have not decided to segment society or understand society by putting it into groups according to what IQ you have, according to tests. We don't talk about people above 100 and below 100, or the 120ers versus the below 80ers. And a final example, we don't do it according to attractiveness. All the studies show that attractiveness is one of the most significant issues in your life, to do with not just your life chances in love, but your life chances in your career. The people who are attractive are disproportionately likely to get on and be promoted in their careers. This is a very significant issue that affects people. For some reason, our society has not decided to institute an understanding of groups by saying there are ugly people and then there's a beautiful group, for instance. Again, I'm glad we haven't, but I simply pointed out there are quite a lot of ways in which we could try to segment a society or categorize people, which we've chosen not to do. For some reason, we've landed on these specific areas to do with race, sex, and sexuality. I'd throw one other issue in there, which is the interesting fact that the underlying metaphysics of the time that we're trying to follow does not seem to be capable of also taking class into account simultaneously. There are lots of interesting reasons for that, which we could get into. But it is striking at this stage that class remains so absent. It could be to do because of the fact that it is so difficult. Layer class over these other issues and you get into a much bigger jumble, a much bigger set of conundrums, we might say, than you do if you just view people because of their race, sex, sexuality. Why we've landed on these particular issues seems to me to be fairly obvious. It's without doubt come from a school of thought which is originated in America from roughly the 1970s to the present. All of the issues to do with identity politics have an unmistakable American bent, an American flavor to them. They have, for instance, a deeply American inheritance to do with racial understanding. Let me give you a quick example of that. The manner in which specific issues of American policing seem capable of flooding out into every other country, as if the issues which are, as I say, debatable, but clearly a problem in American policing, as if they are relevant to policing in, say, Britain or Denmark or Sweden. It was very striking to me when the Black Lives Matter protests got up another head of steam last summer, that they spread out in country after country, as if every country had a George Floyd-like issue. It was very curious seeing rioters in London talking about hands up, don't shoot, for instance, in front of British police who couldn't shoot them if they wanted to because the British police don't carry guns. The same in Sweden and other countries. Very strange to see this complete importing wholesale of a part of a culture war in America. But that's where it seems to be coming from. And that specific culture war in America has its origins, it's under the understanding of the culture war seems to have its origins in an interpretation from American academia in recent decades of what has become known as critical theory. There's now quite a good body of work on this emerging. There didn't used to be, even until a few years ago, even when I was writing The Madness of Crowns, there were not very many texts explaining this because this is an emerging ideology. The emerging ideology of critical theory is now very plain, and the counters to it are starting to emerge. Books like Cynical Theories by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose have done a very good job of explaining the history of critical theory as it's become known in the US. And this theory posits basically that society is best understood through an analysis based on racial, sexual, and sexual orientation terms, but that you cannot do any of these things singly. One of the offshoots of critical theory is the extremely ugly in terminology and fact discipline, so-called discipline known as intersectionality. Intersectionality suggests that to deal with one issue of oppression, you must deal with all issues of oppression. That, for instance, you cannot address women's rights without addressing Black women's rights, and indeed black trans women's rights. So that's what you have to preoccupy yourself with. You cannot single out rights claims. All rights claims are said to interlock. I put this out there because it's a set of claims which now has an extraordinarily significant reach. They are all, in my analysis, not proofs, but assertions. The body of literature which this is based on does not show that society works along these lines or can be solved along these lines. It simply asserts these facts. One of the foundational texts of intersectionality, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, is simply a list of assertions, a set of claims by the academic from Wellesley who wrote that. It is not a science, it is a political scheme that masquerades as having some kind of scientific precept. It talks about the social sciences as if the social sciences are in fact the sciences. All of this, in my view, has to be at the very least critiqued and certainly not simply absorbed wholesale, but it has been absorbed wholesale. One of the most striking things, to my mind, about the whole issue of identity politics is the way in which effectively grown-ups in our societies have imbibed wholesale the claims of people I regard as being entirely fraudulent and not very intelligent academics from often minor universities, sometimes major ones, in the United States of America. It is extraordinary to see, for instance, major governments across the world of developed countries absorbing the claims of critical race theory and trying to enforce them across, for instance, their civil services. That's happened not just in America, but in the UK and other countries as well. And then there's the way in which this has spilt out into the corporate sphere. When I was researching the Madness of Crowds, I've said this before, that it was my presumption that I would find that critical race theory, intersectionality, and much more had washed through academia. I knew that already, but when I found more examples of it, it didn't surprise me. I knew that it was going to be present in a lot of government and taxpayer-funded organizations, NGOs, and much more. One of the great shocks to me was the realization that this had flooded almost wholesale through vast swathes of the corporate world. People tend to think that corporations, the marketplace, and much more will somehow inevitably be immune to these sorts of thought viruses that come along from the radical ideological left. And nothing could be further from the truth. The corporate world, major Forbes 500 companies have done exactly what various professors from Berkeley and others have insisted that they do for years. And there's a very interesting question underneath that, which is, why have they done it? They have done it, it seems to me, to answer my own question, they have done it because they have recognized that there is a significant shift in the ideological winds of their time. And at this stage, it is clear to them what they have to do to get on the right side of those winds. So, for instance, if you want to dodge the bullets from the crowd, you should demonstrate that you have gender equity in your organization. You should demonstrate that you are not just in favor of gay rights, but supportive of campaigning gay organizations, many of which are highly presumptuous in the claims they make and themselves fraudulent in the assertions that they make. You must absolutely prove your dedication to racial justice, racial equality, and indeed racial equity, so that it's not enough to show that you are colorblind in your recruiting process. You have to show, for instance, that you put your staff through implicit bias training. I cannot emphasize enough the extent to which this has rolled out. I've started to realize in recent years that the only people who don't think this movement is coming for them are people who are self-employed and don't have a sort of office space. Because almost all major companies and corporations that I've come across, and again, I look forward to hearing views from all of you, but almost all major corporations and companies I've come across are actually instituting this as we speak, and are instituting it at a quite extraordinarily vociferous level. For instance, a major company, KPMG, a global company, a Fortune 500 company, recently had a discussion of some of its management in one of its offices in the UK, where the discussion of implicit bias training came up. A rather forthright senior member of staff of KPMG said that he thought that implicit bias training was a load of crap, which, by the way, I think it is. And there's plenty of evidence to back that up, that it's not just doesn't do what it claims to do, but couldn't do what it claims to do. This senior manager who said this was immediately reported by some younger colleagues and was fired within 24 hours. So it's not as if the movement I'm describing is passive or seeks for reconciliation with other prevailing views. It doesn't seek to accommodate other views. It doesn't appear to absorb criticisms itself at all easily. It doesn't seem to be open to new ideas. It seems to believe that it has the answer to all societal inequality in our day, and that if it is rolled out far enough, fast enough, and with enough force, it believes that it will answer all remaining problems in our society. I should say, I think it's very clear that it will not, and for reasons I'm very happy to lay out. But it is extraordinary to see an ideology rolled out this far and this fast. And it is especially interesting to see that happen when that ideology has been so little identified. If it was, for instance, simply Marxism, it would be easier to identify because there is a very large body of work on Marxism, a very large body of critical thinking that opposes it, and it would be identifiable. If the critical theory was actually simply National Socialism in a new guise, it would be very easy to identify. It would be very easy to critique. People have had trouble critiquing critical theory and identity politics because it's emerged very fast and also somehow it forced itself towards the mainstream without undergoing very much criticism itself. And I think there are reasons for that. And there are reasons that, broadly speaking, go along the following lines: that the claims that are made begin by being onto something. So, for instance, where identity politics says that it wants to be anti-racist, it inevitably goes a long way very fast, because most people want to be anti-racist. All the polls show that there are very few people in developed Western societies who are actively keen to be racist, actively keen to discriminate against people because of their skin color or racial origin. It's a very minority pursuit, that, very minority bigotry. So when something says we are anti-racist, to join us, it can go quite a long way, quite fast. When it says we are supportive of women's rights, again, all the data shows in countries like ours that most people are in favor of equal rights. Very few people believe that women should be held back from achieving anything they're capable of simply by the fact that they're women. And the same thing goes with gay rights. So in other words, identity politicking has gone so far in part because it has introduced itself by pushing it at an already open door. But it has also in that time presented our societies as things we're not. So it has presented our societies as if we are actually havens of bigotry, as if the countries in the world that are most progressive in terms of equality of the sexes, equality according to sexual orientation, equality irrespective of your racial origins. The countries that are most progressive of this and have come most far are reinterpreted by these people in the light as if we are havens of bigotry, almost unparalleled, not just in history, but in the world today. I was told the other day in a discussion I was doing with a number of journalists around the world, I was told by one Black South African journalist that we live in a white patriarchal society and indeed a white supremacist society. And I said to her, what do you mean by we? She said, everywhere in the world is a white supremacist society. I said, are you in South Africa a white supremacist society? She said, yes, absolutely. This is very common among people who have fallen for or otherwise decided to spout the identity politics critical theory of our time. They're very keen to make assertions which are on their face absolutely inaccurate, wildly inaccurate. But the fact that they are asserted so strongly, so vociferously, and so constantly appears, among other things, to derange and throw off balance many, many people in the societies that they are trying to force their way into. So that when people in Denmark are told, you live in a white supremacist society, racism is everywhere, sexism is everywhere, homophobia is everywhere, always, always, always on the cusp of a Kristallnacht against all minorities and indeed against all women. That when you're told that, it takes a long time to dig yourself out of the analytical trap you've just been thrown into by dint of your society being analyzed so unfairly and so inaccurately. But it puts everybody on the back foot. I think this is one of the things that has gone on in recent years. One of the reasons why identity politics has effectively bamboozled the adults, the intelligent adults in all of our societies so very badly. But it's something, as I say, which is now, and I'll conclude this, it is something now that is so clearly in plain sight that it is now possible to do something about it in a way in which it seemed not very easy to do something about it even 3 or 4 years ago. We now have a grasp of the problem that is rushing towards us. We have an understanding of the conundrum that is being presented to us. And as I have quite often said in recent years, if the era we're living in is one which has completely fallen for the deconstructionist analysis, let us at least do it the favor of deconstructing it. And if we do that, that's a start to returning to some kind of sanity in a discussion which I think has become deranging.
Thank you very much, Douglas. Extremely interesting. One thing I'm wondering about is as you yourself mentioned, I mean, we are probably living in objectively by every measurable parameter, the most tolerant, advanced, rights-based societies at any point in human history. I mean, yes. I couldn't point at any other time than the current situation. How come that we've seen this development within, I mean, I think Denmark is perhaps something like a decade, perhaps a bit less behind the curve as compared to the US and probably also Great Britain. But why are we seeing this? I mean, in this extremely privileged situation that people choose to define themselves by, I wouldn't say it's fictional grievances, but at least as something which has not so long ago been considered, I mean, a marginal nuisance.
Firstly, it's a very good question. Firstly, the issue of Denmark being behind, I think that's true. And it goes back to something I started saying at the beginning, which is that since this has spilt out from the American Academy, it seems to be now obvious that the English-speaking countries absorbed it fastest. It's very interesting to me that, for instance, my own country, Great Britain, Australia and Canada appear to be the countries that have absorbed identity politics fastest. And I think that a very straightforward explanation can be found in the fact that we're English-speaking countries. America is an English-speaking country, and we are especially swiftly vulnerable to American ideologies that spill out from the USA. So that's one reason. And a second, again, this isn't to say, by the way, that people in Denmark don't speak English. My own experience is that they speak English rather better than many people in English-speaking countries. But another reason, it has to do with that simple issue of communication, which is that, for instance, people obsessed with identity politics tend to be obsessed with a retributive analysis of history. They're particularly focused on an analysis of one aspect of American history, slavery. They try to extrapolate that out to the history of empire in my own country. But I think they are absolutely uninterested and incurious about countries which they don't know very much about. So that, for instance, Denmark hasn't especially been in their sights because they're not very interested in Danish history. Even France hasn't been very much in their sights. They don't seem to be very interested in French history. They're certainly not interested in, for instance, Turkish history or any other countries they could focus on and indeed pick at the history of. So there does seem to be something straightforward by way of explanation in that. The rest of the question, though, where you talk about that, because you said that Denmark is perhaps you said 10 years behind the others. I think that's true. I think this will be coming to you. It does come to you, and one of the things you can look forward to in that is this retributive analysis of your society that comes through. The reason why it's happened is complex. One explanation is quite straightforward, however. That's one that, I mean, Jordan Peterson and I in a recent discussion briefly discussed this aspect, which is that one explanation for it is the simple fact that material wealth seems to have been solved in our societies, particularly in a society like Denmark. I'm not, by the way, saying in that poverty doesn't exist, but starvation doesn't exist. For most of our ancestors in the course of human history, the big questions were, where am I going to get my next meal? Will I be able to eat today? Will I be able to eat tomorrow? Those questions of material well-being preoccupied our species for most of our history. In the last couple of generations, they have receded into being almost completely solved in a country like Denmark. So to a great extent, this seems to be something we can do when issues of material well-being have been, if not solved, then at least the very fundamentals of them have been addressed. And there also seems to be a question to do with the accruing of ever more rights and an inability to understand when you've basically accrued equality. And what I mean by that is, would you know when you had reached equality, or would you have reached equality and still be at the barricades? And this is a very complex conundrum, actually, because many people appear to have been at the rights barricades over recent decades, to have won the battle that they were at the barricades for, and yet have remained at the barricades. And people in that position appear to need new things to point to justify their habit of barricade dwelling. So, for instance, in issues to do with equality between the sexes, it's been illegal in the United Kingdom and America to pay a woman less than a man for performing the same job. It's been illegal for 4 or 5 decades now. It's a curiosity that feminist campaigners and others continue to claim that women are ritualistically paid less than men for the same task, deliberately by their employers, and that this is an unfairness in our societies which must be addressed as a priority, when this is at the very least a debatable assertion. The claim that we are institutionally racist as societies is a very, very brutal, wrong analysis, it seems to me, of our societies. But it is one that is constantly asserted and is, as you say, asserted in countries where there's more rights between different racial groups than anywhere in the Middle East, anywhere in Africa, anywhere in South America, anywhere in the Far East. So there does seem to be a problem there, that the people doing the asserting are doing so very vociferously on the basis of ever less evidence. Quite why that is, in a way, is the realm of psychology, but it is a definite problem.
One of the things that it may be just a correlation and not a causality, but I mean, we've seen the rise of this identity politics, wokeism culture has somehow coincided with the spreading of social media. And I mean, in Denmark, it's perhaps slightly atypical because Facebook is by far the largest medium and Twitter is very marginal. It's pretty much journalists and people in the creative upper classes using this, but Twitter is in Denmark. It's extremely woke, and there seems to be some kind of, to me, I'm not quite entirely aware of what the connection is, but there seems to be something about the narcissism, which is also contained within the identity politics. I know it's supposed to be group based, but it is somehow look at my skin color, look at my sexuality, and so on, and the proliferation of social media. Is that something that you would consider?
Yes, I wrote a chapter in The Madness of Crowds on tech and the deranging effects of tech. You're very lucky in Denmark not to have the Twitter preoccupation. Long may you not have that preoccupation. But yes, there is something to do with the platforms. Twitter is especially vulnerable to what my friend Eric Weinstein has termed the Chihuahua effect. The Chihuahua effect is an extremely small, yappy, noisy dog keeps yapping and gets the attention of everyone. The Chihuahua effect works on Twitter especially well, so that somebody can say, it could be somebody with relatively few followers or no followers, can say, I have had my rights in some way trampled upon by this person saying X. Twitter as a medium is especially, it's one of the things that obviously was expected to be good about it, that anyone could come along and contribute to the conversation. But it has allowed the Chihuahua effect to work at its noisiest. An obvious example is somebody posts something, somebody prominent posts something, a Chihuahua yaps about it, and before long, the Chihuahua yap causes a news story of its own. And suddenly the person who's prominent, who posted the thing that the Chihuahua took exception to, is the center of a storm. They have been criticized or called out on social media for something. And as I say, it doesn't matter how minor that claim is that causes the yapping. It can be as small as you listed a group of people and didn't include a list which I'm in. For instance, and I'm not exaggerating here. I mean, I have a friend who is non-binary, and because you didn't mention non-binary people in that list you have just given, you have othered him, disappeared him, and effectively caused him physical harm. I should have said them, obviously, for all of those, but let me stick with him for now. That's a perfectly normal thing to happen on social media, and it has spilt out into the real world. When the author J.K. Rowling, perhaps Britain's most successful author in history, was recently in a row to do with the intersection where trans rights trample over women's rights, and J.K. Rowling stands up for women's rights on this, and by no means is anti-trans, but simply has described the fact that she sees there as being a difference, which there is, and she's completely right on that. When J.K. Rowling's most recent book, a children's book called The Ichabog, was going through the press at her publishers, one of the objections to the book given by a junior employee at the publishers, and the justification for it not being published, was that this junior employee had a non-binary friend. As if this is an explanation in itself for not publishing a book by the most successful and money-making author in the publisher's history. So the Chihuahua effect has undoubtedly moved from social media into the real world. And the interesting question then, the follow-on question is, why don't the grown-ups say, shut up? We don't care. We're not interested. You're boring us. Go away. It's a very interesting question, that. And I'm not certain that there's a straightforward answer.
I just want to mention that if you want to pose questions to Douglas later on in the audience, from the audience, you can write them in the chat box. But you mentioned, Douglas, you mentioned the thing about woke capitalism, which is one of the things that surprised me as well, as to see how easily they seem to incorporate this kind of woke thinking. I remember reading 15 years or so ago a book called The Rebel Cell, which thesis was that much of aesthetics from the left wing were easily incorporated and exploited by capitalism, which was like the joke was on the leftist. But it's increasingly seeming to me that it's the other way around, because the corporate world seems more than eager to incorporate the values. I mean, in connection with the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw just about every major brand in the world posting some kind of support statement and so on. And as you also yourself mentioned, it's been worked into the HR departments in major companies. In Denmark, we have this example. We have an ice cream which is called, it translated, it would be Giant Eskimo. It's just an ice cream with currant, and it's very inoffensive. But there was this outcry about it using the term Eskimo, which should be demeaning to the Inuit. I mean, even the Greenlanders, which has never been a colony of Denmark, it's a part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Even the Greenlanders didn't find it offensive, but nevertheless, the company behind it folded and changed the name of this ice cream. But the support of the Danish population was like 92%, I think, in disagreement with that statement. So it somehow surprises me that even though there doesn't seem to be this broad popular support for these identity politics based decisions, the corporations are still taking these steps. How can that be?
That's a very, very good point. Two things, if I may ask. Did you say the book was called The Rebel Soul?
Rebel Soul. It's by he's called Alan Heath and Andrew Potter. It's a great book. It's called and it has a cover of a coffee cup with Che Guevara on the cover. So it's the idea is that the iconography of the left has easily been cooperated by capitalism. But I mean,
would you send me a link, or send me the title after that?
Yeah, certainly.
Sounding book. Yes, I wasn't aware of the Eskimo ice cream example. That's wonderful, absolutely characteristic. I mean, as always in these cases, it is assume impossible to find an Eskimo, an Inuit, who has wandered into a shop in Copenhagen and seen an ice cream and been woefully, miserably offended by it and immediately had their life choices altered. It is always, and this gets to an important point, it is always this third party offense. And this is a very deep problem, by the way, because as with the I have a non-binary friend issue, it changes the whole nature of offense. Offense can really only principally be taken by somebody themselves. I myself feel offense at something. Now, by the way, even if you do feel offense about something, it doesn't mean that the something is wrong. It could mean that you are wrong. It could mean that something of your understanding is wrong. It's a very strange shift in recent years that offense being taken by the individual must de facto mean that the thing that is allegedly causing the offense is the thing that needs to adapt, not you. But once offense can turn into a third party taking force, something very interesting happens, which is effectively a competition to find things which you can claim to be offended by on behalf of an absent third party. So I take exception on behalf of Inuits for the Eskimo named ice cream. Nobody's asked you to take offense, but you've decided to adopt offense. And that has quite a deep cause itself, which is the odd underlying presumption in our society that we should not just listen to people who claim to have been offended, but actually award them the right to make judgments as a consequence. It's part of, I think, a spillover from the left-wing idea that people who have suffered are somehow right or become virtuous by suffering. A complete misapprehension. There's absolutely no evidence for this, but it is a very left-wing presumption. And it has spilt over into this, and it means that there is effectively a competition to be offended, a competition to claim that you have found something that offends you today on behalf of a third party who's not speaking. I would suggest that there are lots of things to say about this question, but perhaps the one is most useful is this, which is that I've come to the conclusion that the explanation for woke capital is cynical. For instance, the fear that companies had after the death of George Floyd was not just that they wouldn't say the right thing, but that they wouldn't say anything. Because there were people rampaging around at that time on social media and elsewhere who were actually calling out. There was an American celebrity who lost her career effectively, not because of anything she said, but because of something she didn't say. She was accused, Jessica Maloney, was accused by another celebrity of not having spoken about Black Lives Matter. And for this was subjected to the stampede of the mob against her. Companies fear the same thing. Once the Chihuahua says, how dare you not have spoken out about Black Lives Matter, you ice cream company, you, or you high street bank, you, or you manufacturer of crisps, what is it that means you don't speak out? Is it because you are a racist ice cream manufacturer or crisp manufacturer or a racist bank? Again, a healthy society would have adults who turned around and said, don't be so ridiculous. Our business is crisps. Our business is ice cream. Our business is banking. We have no interest in racial politicking. We have no interest in having to speak in the morning depending on the correct actions of a Minnesotan policeman the day before. We don't operate like that. We can't. It's very striking that that isn't what's happened, and that instead so many of the adults in business and elsewhere have been effectively bulldozed by this bullying, which is what it is, and insinuation. At this stage, it's clear that corporations are doing this stuff because it's the cheapest and easiest way to make sure the mob stampedes past them. So if you fly the rainbow flag, you demonstrate that the mob should pass you by. If you put up a BLM sign, virtually or physically, or by doing implicit bias training for your employees, by talking about equity in your organization, you're effectively putting up a don't hurt me sign. Go past my door. You shouldn't rob here because we're on your side. And that is effectively in the corporate world what has started to happen, is that they are putting up don't hurt me signs. And unfortunately, they are being inveigled into a very, very dark and ugly system. And they don't seem to realize that once you've trodden into that system, there is no way out other than jumping right out of it. You will continue to be sucked in and in and in. But for the time being, many corporations think that the cheapest way you can avoid significant reputational harm, to the extent, as an example you give, of closing or of completely changing your brand, that the easiest way of avoiding that is to put up the "don't hurt me" sign of, for instance, having an increased spend on human resources in your company that focuses on gender and racial equity. And what people don't realize is that, among other things, once you've drunk that, you will have to keep drinking it. It's a form of mob payment, a form of Danegeld, actually. But there's much more.
I'm slightly offended by the historic connotations of that analogy.
Sure. It would be better if you were offended on behalf of other Danes.
Certainly. Douglas, the other day I had the pleasure of interviewing Professor Eric Kaufmann, which gave us a very interesting presentation about the growing disparity in academia between self-identifying leftists and people on the right wing. I think we don't have any numbers that I'm aware of in Denmark, but I think that my guess would be that the tendency is pretty much broadly the same. I mean, and it seems to be the gap seems to be ever widening. I mean, you mentioned in your introductory presentation that now, well, we've somehow gotten a grasp of what this critical theory or identity politics or wokeism is consisted of, and we should be able to counter the trends. But how do you see that being done in the real world? What mechanisms could be applied in order to counter that tendency? Because it seems to be so closely associated by the influx of left-wing people in academia, and of course also, as you probably would agree, in journalism also.
That's right. I'm very glad you had Eric Kaufmann. He's a good man. I much admire his work. I suppose his analysis of academia seems to me to be completely accurate, and if anything, overly optimistic. I mean, the situation in academia is, as he knows, is completely dire in my own country and certainly in America. And I think there is a similar crossover in the media. Now, by the way, there are various explanations for that. One is simply that people recruit people like them. I mean, this has been said before that, for instance, an organization like the BBC doesn't recruit people who are left-wing. It recruits people who are sort of liberal in a specific way. I'm not particularly asking for this, but they would not recruit lots of very reactionary people. And that's not for political reasons. In a way, it's for cultural, corporational, cultural reason. It's similar in academia, where recruiting appears to go broadly along the lines of, we will recruit other people who think like us. And one other aspect of that is the extraordinary, again, it's based on a total misunderstanding of society, an extraordinary misinterpretation of society which suggests that there is an enemy in the society, which is conservatives. And by the way, I mean, I'm not exaggerating at all here. The people who have this presumption have an extraordinarily close linkage of all people from the center-right outwards to fascism, white supremacy, and imperialism, and much more. This is, I'm afraid, commonplace as a misunderstanding across great universities, including, for instance, Cambridge University, where academics make the most wild assertions about people in the rest of the society. which are flat out wrong, but persist nevertheless. The figures that we have of, for instance, academics who voted to leave the European Union in 2016 show that there is a bias in a specific direction. That isn't to say that I'm in favor of the bias going in the other direction at all. It's simply that the evidence shows that there is a bias in specific directions. And by the way, in academia, there's a particular additional problem there, which I think is not to do simply with the direction of political travel or motivation, but to do with knowledge. And Professor Neil Ferguson mentioned about 2 years ago now that one of the most desultory observations of his own academic career has been the consistent sight of, for instance, a professor of Russian history or Russian literature, for instance, being replaced by somebody whose specialism is post-colonial feminist thought. You know, that effectively what's been happening at best is over-specialization, but really is over-specialization in an extraordinarily narrow ideological remit. And what is being lost and what has been lost from universities in the last generation is people who, for instance, have simply the wide historical and other understanding that even a generation or two ago would have been expected. Certainly wouldn't have been an anomaly. It would have been the norm. I think this is completely accurate. I think there is a lot of work to do, a lot of thinking to be done about how you rebalance this. I think that conservatives have been wrong in thinking simply that the market would correct. I said this at an academic conference recently, that I think the conservatives ought to admit when their own presumptions are incorrect. And market forces have not corrected ideological pollution in academia. I wish that they had, but student choice has not on its own improved academia. In fact, in the US, it is some of the richest colleges, the best endowed colleges, the ones that have most ability to be ideologically unpolluted, that choose to self-pollute. It is the Harvards and the Yales that have been the worst offenders. And I wish it were possible to say it's merely, you know, colleges vying for sort of woke sign-ups, but it isn't. It's gone much deeper than that, which is a very important question to address itself.
I have a few questions from the viewers, and I'm going to post to you, and then I'll let you go. But one of the things, it's a bit, it's perhaps not so much related to identity politics as such, but though with cancel culture, it's from Maria. She's a teacher herself, and she is wondering about, there is this situation with 3 teachers in a city called Batley, if I recall correctly. They've been suspended for showing or supporting the showing of Mohammed cartoons, which is an issue that we, for obvious reasons, care quite a bit about here in Denmark. And she's wondering that the reactions, in her view, seems to have been quite muted as compared to what happens in regard to the slaying of Mr. Paty in France. And she was interested in hearing your reaction to what the cause of these differences might be.
Yes, it's obviously, as you know, it's an issue which I've spent a lot of energy on in recent decades. There's one obvious reason why it's had less attention, which is that, thank goodness, the teacher in Batley was not murdered. I mean, Samuel Paty's murder in France was serious enough, terrible enough to draw attention. And one obvious reason why the Batley case hasn't had the same attention is, thank goodness, the teacher was not murdered. He has, however, been chased effectively into hiding and is said to be in fear of his life and of his family's lives. This is a very, very serious thing to happen. I actually, if you go to the Spectator's website, you'll see there's a column I've written this week. It just came out this morning, partly to do with this issue. several things. One explanation why there hasn't been more focus on it will be to do with the fact that of the oddity of the times we're living in. We are still in a period where Britain is still in a form of lockdown. Lockdown procedures have only started to lift this week. And so inevitably when the news story number one is everyone being confined to their houses, there's a lot less room for any other stories, most of which would lead the news in any normal time. But that's in some ways an inadequate explanation for this. I think that there is another explanation, which is that Britain is curiously weak on this issue and always has been, much to my own disappointment. I've enormously admired the stance of much of Danish civil society, as well as very, very brave individuals in Denmark, some of whom I'm privileged to count as friends, who absolutely hold the principle of free expression, of freedom of thought that has been so central to our civilization. I think that the bravery that has been expressed in Denmark has been far, far less expressed in the United Kingdom, to the great surprise of many outsiders. There are some explanations for that. One is a sort of conciliatory compromise approach that has tended to be prevalent on the political right as well as the political left in the United Kingdom. There has long been, certainly since the Salman Rushdie affair in 1989, there's long been a sort of attempt to effectively always mediate between the crazy extremists and the rest, to sort of find common ground somewhere in the middle between people who shouldn't be compromised with and the rest of society. That has been a fairly British preoccupation, disappointingly. But we'll see what happens with Batley. My own disappointment principally was to do with the principal of the school, who threw his own employee under the bus. But I think this happens because there is no strong or indeed permissible instinct the other way. My own view is that if parents say this outrage has occurred in the school, the principal of the school at the very least should say, well, your child should not be at this school in that case. I think furthermore, society should be able to say, are you sure you're in the right country? Are you sure you came to the right place? There seems to be a misunderstanding here. But because those things are totally absent from the, as it were, menu of permissible responses, we instead always fall into this position of cringe and compromise, much to my own dissatisfaction, as those of us with you will know.
We have a question from Sophus. He writes that I have heard rumors of British University decolonizing their curricula, whatever that's supposed to mean. My friends keep telling me that it's just a silly fad that will pass in time, but it doesn't seem like that to me. What's your take on the extent of woke curricula in British universities, and just as importantly, lower levels of education in Great Britain?
Yes, it's not a fad at all. It's a very serious challenge. It is the case in Britain, as in America, that you can get anything published so long as it's sort of anti-colonial, post-colonial. It is hard to get anything published, not which is pro-colonialism, but which simply tries to put things in perspective. There was an excellent review recently in The Critic magazine by Professor Nigel Biggar of Christ Church College, Oxford, a very, very fine ethicist, indeed the Regius Professor of Ethics at Oxford. There was a beautiful review by him of a very, very poor recent book called The Brutish Museums, attacking various museums in Britain and elsewhere for their collections and the alleged iniquity of the way in which they were collected. Professor Nigel Biggar simply demonstrated the complete inaccuracies in this book. The woeful lack of scholarship. Why had this book been published? Simply because the academic in question had made a set of fallacious claims that were anti-empire. But it is quite hard to, as I say, just put into context, as Professor Nigel Biggar has done in recent years, to put this into context. It is very serious. the so-called decolonizing is no such thing. It is not simply about taking away pro-colonial thinking, as if any such thing exists at the moment. It is about racializing all studies. It is, for instance, about trying to make sure that any course has an equitable distribution of authors being studied depending on their racial origin. I kid you not that there is not a discipline that this isn't happening in. Even in the classics, and this is a fascinating example, even in the classics, there is a call for more representation of minority voices in the authors being studied. How precisely do you do that? How precisely do you find more female Tacituses? Where do you find them? What do you do about the lack of Black authors and poets and historians in Greek and Roman classical literature? Do you make them up? Do you invent them? Do you decide not to study the area because the thing you want isn't there? Or do you decide to lambast and attack the authors and others who you do have for not being gay enough, or female enough, or Black enough? So when people say decolonizing the curriculum, that is what we're talking about. Again, it is presented as if it is an agreed upon and understood academic goal, and it is no such thing. It is the injection of identity politics into specific disciplines, which do not deserve and cannot cope with, I would submit, the injection that is coming their way. And I'd give one other example of that, which is this is now happening in addition, this is happening in the sciences. It is happening in scientific disciplines where people are being asked to imbibe decolonizing thought. That means, among other things, that they are being asked to imbibe identity politicking into, for instance, engineering. And once you've gone in that direction, all you are doing is polluting a discipline by injecting into that discipline the identity politics that happens to come from the American radical left.
I think I'll pose one final question for you. I think we're a bit over time now, but so it'll be the last one. But I think there might be a bit of hope in your answer, I presume. But let's hear it. It's Simon. He's asking, maintaining a position of conservatism, or really any other position than the progressive woke agenda, which is the order of the day, it seems to be a one-sided battle with ground being continuously lost. It's hard to stay hopeful. Do you believe that there is in fact hope? Can we possibly stem the tide or even turn it?
I'm very hopeful. You're right. I'm very hopeful on that. I've known plenty of causes and cases in my life and career where there is cause to be pessimistic. I don't believe that pessimism is a just because you feel it on one issue doesn't mean you need to feel it on all. And on this issue, I'm really rather optimistic. I'm very struck by the way in which one person who stands up and says that the emperor has no clothes has an extraordinary reach. I don't just mean, for instance, the way in which, say, Jordan Peterson has been able to cut vast swathes through the culture by saying no and by going the other way. I don't just mean the other sort of well-known individuals. I mean, take the example of, there's one teacher at one independent school in New York who earlier this week wrote on Barry Weiss's Substack, Barry Weiss, former employee of the New York Times, who fell out with the paper and went her own way last year. This one teacher at one independent school in New York has written an expose of what is happening at his school and said, I can't do this. I'm not going along with this. Now, what's very interesting about it is not just that people like that do it, but they have a disproportionate effect. This particular teacher was in a whites-only faculty meeting. And think about that for a second. It's routine at this school in New York, as in our schools, for there to be black faculty meetings and white faculty meetings. That at a whites-only faculty meeting, instituted obviously in the name of anti-racism, he said that he had concerns about the things that the pupils were being taught and demanded of them in relation to racism, anti-racism, and much more. And he describes how this immediately kicked off a quite interesting and fruitful discussion, because a lot of other staff seemed to have concerns as well and came up to him publicly and privately to express these. The school clamped down on him, and indeed the most interesting and way moving part of his article was his description of the fact that the school principal ordered all student leaders to read out a denunciation of him to their students. And he describes walking down the corridors, hearing himself being denounced from every classroom. Now, apart from the fact that this should remind us of some of the excesses of the communist era, what this suggests to me is, first of all, that the ideology in question is extraordinarily brittle. It is brittle. It is very vulnerable to pressure being applied anywhere. And my suggestion is that actually individuals like this speaking up have a disproportionate impact. Because so many people have been cowed, because so many people have had things demanded of them and have simply given in order to have a quieter life. As they have had a quieter life, more and more demeaning things have been demanded of them, and they don't like it. So actually, anybody who speaks up and speaks out has a disproportionate cut through. It is undoubtedly scary for people in certain professions, but the opportunity here for an individual as well as for a society is immense. You could be a teacher who blows the whistle, and you could actually have more life chances and career chances as a result. You may find yourself lauded in places you had never imagined yourself being lauded in. Now, this itself doesn't help necessarily if you have a mortgage, but it will help down the line. I think of people like my friend Brett Weinstein and his wife Heather Hying, who used only to teach biology to relatively small classes in one liberal arts college in Oregon. Today, as a result of speaking up, they're very well known internationally, and they talk and teach biology to thousands and thousands of people around the world. So I think that if one sees it like this, sees not just the threat and the risk, but the fact that if you walk through the threat and you walk through the risk and you hold your head up and you straighten your back and walk into this fire, you realize that the bullies and the chihuahuas are not as strong as they like to pretend they are. And you will find a lot of friends and a very warm welcome on the other side after you've walked through the yapping. So I strongly encourage people to walk through that and to come out the other side.
Thank you very much, Douglas Murray. It has been extremely enlightening and very, very interesting. It was a pleasure having you on our program today, and thank you so much for your time. I'll be switching to Danish now, so you will probably wouldn't make that much sense, but it's been very appreciated.
Well, it's been great for me. Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions, and stay well, everyone.
Yeah, well, thank you. Bye. Så skifter vi til dansk. Som jeg sagde indledningsvis, så har jeg fået besøg af Christian Markussen. Han er kommentator på, hvis jeg ellers kan få ham hans kamera på. Christian, kan du det? Oh well. Nå, men i hvert fald hvad kan jeg sige i mellemtiden? Jeg synes, det var mildest talt et interessant oplæg og meget tilgængeligt, og virkelig, virkelig interessante pointer. Hvis der er nogen, der kom ind lidt sent i det, så som vi plejer at gøre her på Kontrast, så får vi det selvfølgelig redigeret sammen, og så lægger vi det online i morgen, så hvis du kun kommer ind halvvejs, så har du altså muligheden for det. Der er ikke mere Douglas Murray nu, så nu er det bare mig og Christian, der snakker om det her lidt ud på en lidt mere uformel måde, ud fra en dansk kontekst. Hvad siger du, Christian? Hvad var din opfattelse af Douglas?
Jamen altså noget af det, jeg hæfter mig ved, og det er jo det her med, det er hans håb, altså det sidste, også, og det er også noget, jeg egentlig går med i forhold til Danmark specifikt. Danmark er sådan, jeg tror, vi er unikt modstandsdygtige faktisk over for det her. I snakkede om, at vi var 10 år bag den udvikling, der er, og det kan godt være, men jeg tror faktisk, at vi har større modstandskraft end mange andre lande, både på grund af sådan en kulturel fanden i voldsked, altså sådan en, du skal fandme ikke bestemme, hvad jeg siger-agtig. Og så også tror jeg, at Muhammed-krisen har bragt snakken om ytringsfrihed op på en måde i Danmark, som den ikke har gjort andre steder. Så når vi hører om folk, der på en eller anden måde mister det privilegie at kunne ytre sig osv., så er det noget, vi reagerer voldsommere på. Og jeg synes også, der er spor af det. Altså vi kan jo se de her små eksempler, der også er i Danmark på det her. Og der synes jeg, at reaktionen fra befolkningen i hvert fald har været sund. Man kunne godt ønske sig en bedre reaktion fra nogle meningsdannere og fra nogle rektorer og så videre, ikke? Men altså, som befolkning har det sgu været fuck off, ikke? Og det synes jeg er skønt at se.
Ja, altså jeg synes jo også, at det er jo en god point. Altså nu nævner han jo Bret Weinstein som en af dem, der har formået at skabe sig en karriere på egen hånd inden for det univers. Altså Jordan Peterson vil jo selvfølgelig være et meget oplagt eksempel også, men der er jo også folk som, altså nu har han selvfølgelig et stort og etableret navn i forvejen, men altså jeg kan jo se Andrew Sullivan, som, jeg kan ikke huske, om det var Vox, eller hvor det var, han smuttede fra, men hvor han endte med også, det endte også med at blive et meget woke media. Nu er han jo så gået på Substack, som er den her sådan blogging-platform, man kan tjene penge på via abonnenter. Og der er han jo blevet rigtig, rigtig stor. Derudover så kan man jo sige, at altså nogle af dem, jeg selv følger rigtig meget, jeg synes er super interessante, det er Glenn Loury og John McWhorter, som er på en platform, en ret gammel platform, der hedder Blogging Heads, hvor de har hver 14 dage en samtale. De kalder sig The Black Guys at Blogging Heads. John McWhorter er lingvist, og Glenn Loury, han er økonom, men de beskæftiger sig også rigtig meget med hvad kan man sige, identitetspolitik og race-related issues, og de har simpelthen også formået at få i hvert fald en ret stor opbakning bag de her ting. Så det tænker jeg jo også. Men jeg ved ikke, altså jeg havde en diskussion med hvad det hedder, både en kollega i journalistverdenen og også en god ven, Søren K. Willemoes, der er på Weekendavisen for tilbage i 2013, og hvor han sagde, det her woke-halløj, det kommer til at ramme os rigtig, rigtig hårdt, og jeg var sådan lidt, vi er sgu så uhøjtidelige, vi danskere, og det kommer ikke til at være det, der fylder herover. Men nu, sådan 7-8 år senere, der sidder jeg der og tænker, at det var, altså der tog jeg rimelig meget fejl. Og han havde ret. Jeg synes, at vi ser utrolig mange af de tendenser på en helt anden måde, end hvad man har set før. Så jeg er da sådan lidt nervøs. Nu ser vi også universitetsverdenen, hvor det fylder rigtig meget.
Jo, men der er ikke nogen tvivl om, at vi har ikke set toppen endnu i Danmark. Det var mere sådan for at skyde lidt positiv energi i. Og også for at sige, at den her modstand, synes jeg er... Altså, de ting, Douglas Murray snakker om, er jo sådan lidt et varselsskud, ikke? Det er sådan et kald til kamp også, tænker jeg, i Danmark. Altså, at vi kan se det her, der er derude, og vi har faktisk gode muligheder for at holde det væk. Så det er ikke for at sige, at det ikke er der, og det er ikke for at sige, at det ikke kommer, fordi det gør det, og vi ser det jo også særligt blandt unge, altså på studiemiljøer og så videre. Og de unge universitetsstuderende, de bliver jo lektorer og rektorer på et tidspunkt. Så det kommer. Og vi ser det jo også i kulturverdenen. Der er sådan et eksempel på den her film Shorta, som er instrueret af to hvide og skrevet af 2 hvide instruktører og har fået masser af succes og solgt en masse. Men der er jo så også nogen, der problematiserer, at 2 hvide overhovedet kan få sig selv til at skrive perker i et manuskript, for eksempel. Hvordan kan de få sig selv til det? Så i stedet for, at man går ind og sådan angriber filmen, sådan snakker om, den er realistisk eller urealistisk, og på en eller anden måde går ind og argumenterer på den måde, jamen, så vælger man at knytte op på, også i hvert fald at knytte op på identiteten på instruktøren og forfatteren. Og det er jo et eksempel på, at det er noget, der er i Danmark. Og altså jeg synes, i Danmark der er det særligt køn lige nu. Det er der, hvor vi snakker om at gå ind og regulere. Altså hvad er kønsbalancen i forskellige erhverv? Vi er ikke så meget begyndt på det her med, hvordan ser den etniske sammensætning. Men det er der dog. Altså politikken har jo sådan medgivet en kritik på, at måske har de ikke helt nok med anden etnisk baggrund. Og der er jo bevægelser for at på en måde, at det også skal være noget, vi skal til at tage hensyn til. Altså ikke bare sådan stræbe efter at få en eller anden balance i det, men simpelthen også at gå ind og regulere på forskellige vis. Altså så det er der, og der kommer mere af det. Men jeg tror, vi kan stå imod meget af det, og jeg virkelig også opfordrer alle til at være den, som Douglas Murray der taler om her, ikke? Altså være den, der siger fra. Altså fordi det er ikke så dyrt her, som det er i England og USA endnu.
Nej, altså jeg tror også nogle gange, så slår det mig. Altså jeg har jo sådan en, altså nu kan man jo sige, det er jo nok ikke nogen hemmelighed, at jeg er journalist og også rimelig borgerlig. Jeg tror mange har en idé om, at det er ret svært. Det har egentlig aldrig været mit indtryk. Altså det har aldrig været indtryk af, at der er sådan en strukturel repression. Altså tværtimod blev jeg hevet ind for penge og skrive klummer for politikken, hvor jeg dybest set ikke lavede andet end at skrive mindre pæne ting om Lidegaard. Det er ikke, der er ikke så meget, det ved jeg ikke, det kan sagtens være, det er forskelligt andre steder, og jeg ved, at Kasper Støring har blandt andet på Kontrast skrevet en klumme om inden for den akademiske verden kan det være lidt anderledes, det vil jeg slet ikke udelukke, men jeg vil sige, at jeg tror også, det handler om et eller andet sted måske at have viljen til at løbe en risiko. Jeg kan se, at Anne-Marie har et spørgsmål, så jeg tænker, at jeg lige unmuter her. Ups. Jeg tror, hun skal acceptere anmodningen.
Ja, okay. Spændende diskussion. Hvad hedder det? Jeg har sat kamera på. 2 sekunder. Ja. Nå nej, jeg kan ikke sætte kamera på. Okay, det er i orden. Vi tager nej, det er også fuldstændig lige meget. Nej. Men utrolig spændende diskussion, utrolig spændende oplæg fra Douglas Murray. Jeg tænker omkring Danmark, der måske er nogle forskellige ting, der foregår, som måske lidt peger i forskellige retninger. På den ene side, så synes jeg oplever, at jeg også underviser, når jeg ikke skriver, en eller anden snigende, altså at nogle af de her identitetspolitiske teorier, de sniger sig ind i undervisningsverdenen, de sniger sig ind i skoleverdenen. For eksempel heteronormativitet bliver sådan et emne, noget som forskellige lærere kan synes, hold da op, hvor er det spændende, og så kan man lige pludselig komme ud som censor, og så dansklæreren har smurt heteronormativitet ud over det hele, og queer tekstanalyser osv. Jeg synes ikke, man skal undervurdere det. Der bliver udgivet undervisningsmateriale også, som handler meget om queer-teori, som handler meget om feminisme, og hvad har vi? Noget andet, tænker jeg også omkring Danmark, NGO'er, som vi får masser af tilskud. Det er noget, Henrik Dahl har peget på her for nylig. NGO'er, som også får nogle af de her ting ud, for eksempel sex og samfund, netop omkring heteronormativitet, at så er det noget, de får lov til at undervise i skolen, i de ældste klasser osv. Så altså, der tænker jeg, at der er nogle ting, vi også skal holde øje med. Omvendt, så tænker jeg også, apropos det med skolen, der var den der sag i Københavns Kommune for nylig med, de ville give, jeg ved ikke hvor mange millioner efter, så nogen, der skulle undervise i normkritik, heteronormativitet osv. Og det skulle så rulles ud over, så vidt jeg husker, sådan helt fra daginstitutioner op i hele skolesystemet. Så vidt jeg ved, så blev det ikke vedtaget, men det var noget, som var ret tæt på at blive vedtaget i Københavns Kommune. Jeg tænker også nogle gange, apropos det der med Douglas Murray, der siger, at det enkelte individ kan gøre en forskel og kan råbe op. Indimellem så tænker jeg, at nogle af de der, hvad kunne det være, forældre til skolebørn, andre borgere, der møder nogle af de her minoritetsteorier, at de simpelthen tænker, det er simpelthen bullshit det her, sådan lidt, hvad kan man kalde det, sådan common sense, klodshands-agtigt, og kæft noget frøvl det her, altså, så, hvor man kunne lidt brøle op, altså protestere i forskellige sammenhænge, hvad kunne det være, skolebestyrelser eller noget andet, så sådan lidt begge dele, kan man sige. Nogle strømninger, som er lidt foruroligende, noget der sniger sig ind, men også en eller anden, tror jeg også, modstand fra mange almindelige danskere, eller hvad man skal kalde det.
Bare lige for at høre, hvad er din egen baggrund i forhold til, at du folkeskolelærer, eller?
Nej, altså jeg er HF-underviser. Underviser i dansk og filosofi.
Ja.
Så jeg har oplevet det ikke, fordi det er massivt, men jeg har oplevet det sådan nogle gange sådan omkring undervisningsmateriale. Men ellers så følger jeg med i debatten. Altså jeg tænkte, det der med Københavns Kommune, synes jeg var ret interessant. Det var, så vidt jeg ved, altså de fik ikke flertal for det i borgerrepræsentation, men jeg tænker også nogle gange, jeg har diskuteret meget ofte med venner og bekendte, altså sådan et eller andet dansk snusfornuft, det gider jeg simpelthen ikke, det skal mine børn ikke udsættes for. Jeg håber lidt, at folk også på den måde vil reagere, så kan man måske glæde sig over i Danmark, at folk ikke er så autoritetstro og ligesom kæfter op, men netop også det der med alt det der med medbestemmelse og skolebestyrelse og Forenings-Danmark, og hvad har vi? Altså, så ja, det er sådan lidt både og, vil jeg sige. Altså.
Jeg kan se, Oliver, han skriver over i kommentarerne, at han oplever præcis det, du også oplever. Han er gymnasielærer i dansk og engelsk. Det er jo måske relativt ved at brede sig. Jeg kan jo også se, at sex og samfund har i forbindelse med den her uge 6-kampagne, og det er jo så i grundskolen også kørt nogle af de her altså mere socialkonstruktivistiske opfattelser af køn igennem, hvor man jo slår til lyd for, at køn er en social konstruktion, der er mere eller mindre uafhængig af biologien, og det er jo, må man jo sige, at et af de sådan mere grundpillerne i det, vi kan kalde moderne identitetspolitik. Så.
Men jeg tror...
du siger, Christian,
ja, men jeg tænker bare, at det er jo helt rigtigt, at angrebet, hvis vi kan kalde det, kommer jo til at være via uddannelsessystemet. Altså nu snakkede vi om universiteter, men ja, det er jo også gymnasier, og det er også folkeskoler. Og man kan sige modsat, altså du taler om, hvordan du som journalist ikke har noget problem med at være borgerlig. Jeg tror, det er mit indtryk, at der er det måske lidt sværere, i hvert fald i folkeskolen, at være den, der siger fra over for de her ting, som indfinder sig. Ikke? Så det er nemmere sagt end gjort, tror jeg. Der tror jeg, det er lidt nemmere at være journalist, lige hvad det angår.
Ja, det kunne jeg sagtens forestille mig. Absolut. Vi er ved at nærme os de halvanden time, som jeg havde lovet, vi være grænsen for det her. Jeg vil sige, det kan jeg måske i det her eksklusive forum sige, hvad vi har i pipeline. I går har vi optaget 2 programmer, der er ved at blive klippet og kommer ud her for nylig. Henrik Dahl har interviewet i Henriks halvtomme glas, har interviewet Ph.D. og lektor emeritus er han nu med Medlemsarrangementer, der også er forfatter til bogen af danskerne racister, sammen med desværre nylig afdøde Henning Bæk. Og også i studiet er Sofie Danneskjold Samsø, der også har forsket i beskæftiget sig med integrationsforskning ret meget. Det er et ret interessant program. Det tror jeg, at folk, der synes, den her diskussion var spændende, også vil kunne se frem til. Så har vi i Silles Sorte Skole med Silla Halleholm har besøg af Morten Messerschmidt til en snak om Dansk Folkepartis nye udspil. Hvis I undrer sig over, der ikke er noget med Meldt og Fæld, jamen det var simpelthen fordi det er optaget i går før. Og det havde vi nok heller ikke dækket i et uddannelsesprogram alligevel, men det kan være, det kommer i en anden kontekst senere. Og så har vi også lidt dækning af identitetspolitik her i Den Blå Team, som jeg optog her 2 timer før vi gik i luften med Douglas Murray, hvor jeg har besøg af Jakob Thøring, der er mangeårigt Venstremedlem, og også i øvrigt formand for Venstre her på Vesterbro, og Nikolaj Svejgaard, der er politisk og strategisk konsulent for Liberal Alliance. Og så Michael Jalving, der kommer vi også blandt andet ind på at snakke ret meget om identitetspolitik. Og jeg kan også lokke eller skræmme med, at jeg faktisk synger en lille passage af Sikander Siddiques ny Ramadan-sang. Så hvis det ikke har skræmt folk væk, så ved jeg ikke rigtig, hvad der gør det. Jeg vil sige tusind tak, fordi I så med. Det har været et privilegie. Jeg synes, det var virkelig, virkelig interessant at høre Douglas Murrays kommentarer, og også tak til dig, Christian. Jeg håber på et tidspunkt, jeg ved jo, du sidder ikke i Storkøbenhavn, som jo desværre er der, hvor vi lidt er begrænset til at få gæster fra, særligt i de her coronatider. Men jeg håber, hvis du grammer København en dag, så må lige sige til, så skal du være med i panelet på Den Blå Team på et tidspunkt. Det kunne jeg rigtig godt tænke mig om. Og så vil jeg jo så sige, nu ser det ud til, at forsamlingsrestriktionerne bliver hævet lidt, og en af de store ambitioner med Kontrast har jo været at lave begivenheder i den virkelige verden, hvor man både kan høre oplæg, men også mulighed for at tale med andre abonnenter og stille spørgsmål og så videre. Så jeg håber på, at og jeg vil i hvert fald gerne afgive et løfte om, at så snart vi får muligheden for, at vi kan forsamles lidt flere end 10 eller 20 indendørs, så vil vi meget gerne invitere alle til forskellige arrangementer. Og det bliver ikke kun i København. Vi har også en ambition om at komme rundt om i landet, så man også kan få mulighed for at deltage i ting andre steder end her i København K, hvor jeg sidder lige nu. Så tusind tak, fordi I så med. Det har været en fornøjelse, og nu vil jeg cykle hjem til Amager, og tak for det. Hej.